Okay, in this lecture we're going to talk about what's happening really between about 149, which is the end of the Third Punic War, down to about the 120s. As you can see here, I've titled this slide the Gracchi. We're going to talk about two brothers, the Gracchus brothers, and I've given you the dates here. And I've also subtitled this The Beginning of the Downfall of the Roman Republic. So far we've spent quite a bit of time looking at their expansion, how the society was working, and what we'll see now are sort of the effects of all of this expansion. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. This is sort of in addition to this at a bit later. In terms of background, so we've already looked at this. After these Punic Wars, you have really an empire. It's not called an empire yet because we don't have any of the emperors, but it really is. So you've got the Romans controlling all of Italy. You've got Spain, North Africa. They're sweeping northwards into Northern Europe, which will soon become a province. They're also taking over Greece and moving into Asia Minor and starting to move into the Mediterranean area, the Eastern Mediterranean area. And of course, what this does is it means that they've controlled massive amounts of land. Now, I don't have it on the slide here, but if you start reading through some of the Roman historians who are writing about this period, one of the common themes throughout the histories written by the Romans is greed. How greed led to sort of a decline in the morals of the Romans, and this led to lots of social issues. So this is sort of part of the background to this as well. Now, what would happen when these areas were taken over is that the rich, usually senators, would sweep in and take control of the land and set up these large estates called latifundia. There were lots of issues for that. Of course, it's good for the rich. They were really run by large numbers of slaves. And we'll be talking about slaves and the whole thing next week. And we've talked a little bit about them before. But you've got these large estates where they've gobbled up usually the best amount of land and then run everything by slaves. Now, part of the issue is this, and you can imagine this might be the case, is in all of these wars, soldiers are coming back home to finding that their land has been taken from them, or that there's no employment because you've got these large estates that are now dealing with massive amounts of agriculture, and a little farm run by a soldier can't compete with a latifundia. So they've come home, there's no work, there's no land for them to work on, and this causes loss. Okay, now moving into the Gracchi, or the Gracchi brothers. I've given you the dates here. You've got two brothers, Tiberius and his younger brother Gaius. They come from an extremely influential, wealthy family. They're grandsons of the famous Scipio Africanus. This is the Scipio Africanus that we talked about in the Second Punic War. Their own father was a consul twice and then a censor. And remember, censor is pretty high on the social status list. Now, Tiberius becomes a quaestor in 137 BC, and in the process of all his traveling that he had to do for this particular position, he noticed lots of social issues that were happening, mostly based on this land grab by the wealthy and setting up these latifundia. And what you see is just what I told you about in the last slide, people coming back from these wars and not having land to work on. So they become extremely poor and very unhappy. Now, Tiberius Gracchus decides to help with this. So in 133 BC, he proposed this law that's called the Sempronian Law. And it was considered to be fairly radical for its time because what it ended up doing is severely restricting the amount of land that a wealthy person could control or own. So what we're talking about here is as the Romans are gaining more and more land through occupation, the land itself becomes state-owned, and then the state will actually sell off this land. So senators would go in and take gigantic chunks of land, and as I mentioned, it'd be the best agricultural land, and then leave everything else for everybody else. So Tiberius wanted to change this with this law, and what it did was it said one person cannot own more than 300 acres, or if you have a large family, you can have 1,000 acres. Anything that was left with this public land would be given to the poor. So this is one way that he devised to really help this social condition that had happened because of all of this land occupation by the Romans. Now, why do this? Why help the poor? Well, of course, that's part of the function of the tribune. But beyond that, I have to say there's tons and tons of scholarship and tons of debate on what all of this means. So what I've given you here is sort of 3 bullet points, and I start off each one by saying some scholars think or some scholars believe. So some, when they're thinking about why did he do this, they see that the Roman population was dropping, and that giving land to the poor would, of course, allow them to grow more food, which would allow their families to get larger, and then this would increase the population. And of course, some also see the increase in the number of slaves. And I've given you here a page to an article you should have read by Delict, 728, 731, which gives some statistics for this. Now, some scholars, this is related to the first part, is that it would increase the size of the population. And one aspect of increasing your population is that you can get a larger military. So they thought maybe Tiberius Gracchus was doing this for this very reason. And then others think it was just simply to help the Italians, or those that weren't considered to be Roman, and of course the Roman citizens. So I don't mean to confuse the issue, but there really isn't one solid answer for why Tiberius Gracchus ended up doing this. There's a whole bunch of things in play here, and what I've tried to do is giving you some things that scholars end up saying as a reason for why he ended up doing this. Now, Tiberius Gracchus knew that this would not be very popular with the wealthy. And what he ended up doing is going right to the popular assembly, making a big speech, and I've given you some of that and some of his story in the primary text readings. So he gives these big speeches, and what he decided to do in terms of doling out this land was to set up a 3-person commission. And of course, he's on it, his brother's on it, and his father-in-law, and I've given you his father-in-law's name on it. They then ran for a second term as tribune, and so far, running for the office of consul, running for the office of tribune, is not usually done a second time. If it is done a second time, it's sometimes seen as you are grabbing for power. So he ran for a second term, and what you can see here is that he was highly unpopular with a lot of the wealthy, and you have basically a fight happening in the streets, and they ended up killing him along with 300 of his followers. Now, a little bit of background to this, which I didn't mention, there's also a tribune named Optimius, and Optimius was really for helping the wealthy senator, so he didn't want this land law to go through, and Tiberius was trying to remove him from office. So anyway, Tiberius gets killed along with 300 of his followers, all, I should say, done without trial, so they were just murdered. However, the commission was allowed to continue. So his brother was on it and his father-in-law was on it. Now then comes his brother Gaius. And I've given you the dates here. He was elected tribune in 123 and again in 122. Also put forth a series of laws that not only had to do with the land law, but also new colonies and so on. And some interesting things like, who should provide for soldiers when you have this large military? Well, Gaius thought that the state actually should provide clothing. Another interesting thing that makes a big impact on the history of Rome for centuries is that the state should buy grain in bulk. And what that means is you actually can get grain at a cheaper price, and then of course store it, and then give it to the Roman people below market value, which doesn't sound like a very good thing to do economically because you buy it at a certain price and then you sell it below. But the idea is that it makes him very popular with the poor, and of course it helps out the poor population, which is the vast amount. He ran for tribune again in 121. As you can see here, he lost. Now, he was not as popular, or he wasn't popular just like his brother with the wealthy. And you see a lot more fighting in the streets once again about this whole issue over land and what the wealthy should be doing, what the poor should be doing. And if you remember, I talked about Optimius. So he, one of the servants of him was killed one of the servants of his, excuse me, was killed. And this was blamed on Gaius and his supporters. And so you get this interesting decree being issued, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum. And really what that meant is that he could be killed by anybody. And so he fled to Palatine Hill, and where he was murdered. And if you remember, his brother was murdered along with 300 of his friends. Gaius was murdered with about 3,000 of his supporters. Again, without trial, without really hearing their case, and so on. There's lots of debate in the scholarship, like a lot of these issues that we're looking at, about what was done, why it was done, and what are the effects of this. So I've titled this slide Martyrs. So a martyr is someone who dies for the cause. And it's believed by some that they really were martyrs. They were trying to help the poor people, the poor Italians, the poor Roman citizens, through this time of this big land grab. One of the things that came out of this is that the poor people really realized that they had power. So they probably knew this before, but they really realized it now, especially after the last massacre of Gaius and his supporters. What this really did was made the Senate look weak. So you've got the poor people, the plebs, realizing they have more power, and the Senate seems to look weak. This is going to set up a lot of issues in the next 50 or 60 years that we'll talk about in a further lecture. And what's really interesting is that some of these land reforms that were made by these two brothers remained. So the Senate did not go through and reject every single thing. In fact, some of these were expanded on, so they made it actually easier. I will say too that you shouldn't be thinking that the Roman Republic was sort of stagnant in terms of enlarging. That definitely was not the case. You have a couple other provinces or states, if that's how you want to think about them, being created. You've got the Kingdom of Pergamum, and it's a really interesting story that the king, Attalus III, put in his will that he wanted to give the Romans his kingdom. And so he died in 133, which, as I put here, if you remember, this is the same year that that should be Tiberius, introduced his reforms. And what he ended up doing is saying, look, we've got this huge new kingdom. Let's start dividing up the land according to the proposals that I'm giving. This new province was called Asia, and of course, like what the Romans had done before, they built all these roads to reach this area. You also have Gaul, part of Gaul becoming a province, Gallia Transalpine or Narbonensis. So you do have this expansion continuing. We will talk more about the effects of this land expansion and what it does in terms of helping out some wealthy people to become incredibly wealthy and bringing up more issues for the poor in our next lecture.